The low rumble of the 12-cylinder engine echoed through the quiet suburban streets as David carefully pulled his Lamborghini Aventador into the driveway. Neighbors peeked through curtains, some admiring, some frowning. To David, this car was not just a toy. It was a symbol. After serving nearly 2 decades in the military, surviving deployments most people could not imagine, he had finally retired and built a new life. He invested wisely: real estate, index funds, even a few risky plays in the stock market that paid off. And now, at 42, he could finally enjoy some of the things he had always dreamed about. The bright metallic orange Lamborghini, worth every penny of its $300,000 price tag, was more than a car. It was a reward, a reminder that sacrifice and discipline eventually paid off. But to Karen, the president of the Homeowners Association with a reputation for micromanaging everything from mailbox paint to trash and placement, the car represented something else entirely: arrogance. And the moment she saw it, she decided it did not belong in her neighborhood. David knew the Homeowners Association had rules, but he was not breaking any. His driveway was large enough for 3 vehicles, and the Lamborghini was parked neatly within his property line. He had checked the Homeowners Association handbook the day he bought the house, and nothing in it prohibited exotic cars. Still, within 24 hours of bringing the Aventador home, an envelope appeared on his doorstep. Inside was a notice written in stiff, bureaucratic language. "Your vehicle does not meet the standards of our community. Please remove it within 7 days to avoid penalties." David laughed out loud. Standards? This was a world-class machine, not some rusted-out junker. He marched into his office, pulled up the Homeowners Association's bylaws and scanned every line. Nothing. Absolutely nothing about car types. He fired back an email. "Your notice has no legal basis. The vehicle will remain parked in my driveway." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, certain that would be the end of it. But when it came to Karen, nothing was ever that simple. Karen saw herself as the guardian of the neighborhood's so-called property values. She believed luxury cars like Lamborghinis screamed recklessness, attracting the wrong kind of attention. In her mind, the sight of a bright orange supercar clashed with the carefully curated image of quiet suburban respectability. She brought it up in the next Homeowners Association meeting, raising her voice about preserving the character of the neighborhood. Some nodded along, others rolled their eyes, but Karen did not care. She thrived on control. What she did not expect was David's calm defiance. To her, that was a direct challenge. And if there was one thing Karen could not stand, it was losing control. So, she escalated. The next day, David found another envelope. This one, a so-called fine for $500, citing a vague clause about unsightly displays that reduce community harmony. David chuckled bitterly. $500 was nothing compared to what he had endured overseas. He tossed the letter in a drawer and went back to polishing the Aventador. But Karen was not done. Not by a long shot. As the weeks went on, the battle intensified. David kept meticulous records, emails, letters, photos, all of it. He knew from his military days that documentation was power. And in finance, too, paper trails told the truth. Still, the Homeowners Association continued sending fines, each one more absurd than the last. $750 for noise pollution, even though the Aventador was parked. $1,000 for visual clutter, as if the car was some old washing machine on the lawn. By the end of the month, they claimed David owed $4,500. David laughed again. He had fought enemies far deadlier than a suburban board. He was not intimidated. But then things crossed a line. One morning, David woke to the sound of shattering glass and the gut-wrenching scrape of metal. He rushed outside to find Karen standing in his driveway, holding a rock, her face red with fury. The Lamborghini's windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, its flawless hood gouged with scratches. "This car does not belong here," she screamed. David froze, his training kicking in. He had faced combat, but this was different. This was personal. Neighbors began gathering, phones out, recording. Karen did not care. She was on a tirade about property values, shouting that David's car lowered everyone's investment potential. David clenched his fists but stayed composed. His military discipline would not let him react the way his body wanted. Instead, he pulled out his own phone, recording every second. "Karen," he said evenly, "you just committed felony vandalism on private property. That is destruction of assets valued over $300,000. Do you understand what that means?" Karen froze, her eyes darting to the phones pointed at her. For the first time, her bravado cracked. David continued, "That is not a homeowners association violation. That is a criminal offense. And trust me, the law takes that a lot more seriously than your fake fines." He dialed the police on speaker, his voice steady, his hands calm. When the dispatcher answered, David spoke clearly. "I need officers at my address immediately. I have a homeowners association president who just vandalized my property. Damage is extensive, and I have video evidence." The words hung in the air like a hammer dropping, and Karen's smugness drained away in an instant. The police arrived faster than David expected, red and blue lights reflecting off the gleaming, now damaged hood of his Lamborghini. Karen tried to play the role of victim, her voice trembling with fake outrage as she pointed at David and claimed he had threatened her. But the officers were not buying it. Too many neighbors had their phones up, capturing every detail. David calmly handed his phone to one officer, showing the clear video of Karen hurling the rock and screaming about property values. The officer studied the footage, then turned to Karen with a look of weary disbelief. "Ma'am, this is evidence of felony property destruction," he said. "Do you realize the severity of damaging a vehicle worth over $300,000? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. David stood silently, arms folded, every inch the composed veteran who had faced real battlefields. Inside, though, his heart was pounding, not with fear but with controlled fury. He knew this was no longer a petty homeowners association dispute. This was now a case with criminal implications, and Karen had just set in motion consequences she never anticipated. Karen was not arrested on the spot, but the police issued her a citation and informed her that charges would be filed. They also told David to file a claim through his insurance, but he knew better. He had comprehensive coverage, yes, but the deductible on a supercar like the Aventador was steep. And even worse, insurance payout might classify the damage as a liability event, raising his premiums for years. David had spent enough time studying finance to understand that sometimes the smarter move was not just to lean on insurance, but to pursue direct restitution. He made it clear to the officers that he would be pressing charges and filing a civil lawsuit for damages. "This is not about money," David explained, his voice firm. "It is about accountability. She used her position in the Homeowners Association to harass me, and now she has destroyed property I worked my entire career for. This is going to court." The officers nodded, impressed by his composure. Karen, meanwhile, looked pale, as if the reality of her situation was finally settling in. That night, David sat at his desk and began assembling a war chest of evidence. Military discipline had taught him to prepare every detail before an engagement, and this was no different. He organized every homeowners association notice, every fine, every email exchange, and paired them with photos of his pristine driveway, time-stamped, showing the Lamborghini perfectly parked. He created a digital folder with multiple backups, even uploading one to cloud storage under a separate account, just in case Karen tried anything further. Then, he drafted his legal plan. He reached out to a property attorney who specialized not only in homeowners association disputes, but also in asset protection. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Amanda, was blunt after reviewing the evidence. "This is open and shut. She is liable for the damage, the harassment, and even punitive damages for abuse of power in her position as Homeowners Association president. We're not just talking about a repair bill, David. We are talking about 6 figures in potential compensation." David leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had fought for his country. Now he was about to fight for his home, his reputation, and his investment. The Lamborghini itself was a financial asset beyond just being a car. David had bought it not only as a passion purchase, but also as part of a diversified portfolio. Exotic cars, when cared for properly, could appreciate in value, especially limited production models like his Aventador. Karen's reckless act had not just scratched paint. It had jeopardized the long-term appreciation of an asset he had calculated into his retirement plan. David remembered explaining this to a fellow veteran once. Real estate, stocks, bonds, those are solid. But collectibles like rare cars, they can outperform the market if you know what you were doing. Now, thanks to Karen, that careful strategy was under threat. The repair bill alone would run into the tens of thousands. But more importantly, the car's resale value had taken a permanent hit. Amanda confirmed this in their first consultation. We are going to pursue not just repair costs, but diminished value damages. A Lamborghini with a history of vandalism, even if repaired, will never be worth what it once was. She owes you that difference. And given the car's rarity, we are talking about a substantial sum. David nodded grimly. This was no longer just personal. It was financial justice. Karen, however, doubled down in the following days. She began sending out letters to the entire neighborhood, painting herself as the victim of an aggressive veteran who was destabilizing the community. She wrote that David's Lamborghini was a nuisance, that his defiance of Homeowners Association rules was undermining property values, and that she had acted out of desperation to protect the neighborhood's financial integrity. David could hardly believe the audacity. He watched as some neighbors started whispering, while others openly supported him, disgusted by Karen's antics. But David was not shaken. He knew smear campaigns well. Propaganda was nothing new. What Karen did not understand was that truth, backed by documentation, always won in the end. David drafted his own letter, distributing it door to door. In it, he explained calmly that Karen's claims were false, attaching screenshots of the bylaws that proved he had broken no rules. He mentioned his military service, his investments in the community, and even his perspective on how protecting property rights was essential for preserving long-term financial stability. Neighbors were stunned. Many who had wavered now rallied behind him. Karen, instead of isolating David, had isolated herself. The media caught wind of the story within a week. A local news station showed up at David's driveway, cameras capturing the sight of the damaged Lamborghini under a tarp. David spoke clearly, not as a man looking for fame, but as a veteran demanding accountability. He talked about how homeowners associations often overstepped, how property owners needed to understand their rights, and how financial security was tied not just to investments on paper, but to protecting physical assets from abuse. "This is bigger than me," David told the reporter. "This is about every homeowner who has ever been bullied by a homeowners association, fined unfairly, or harassed for no reason. If someone can destroy a $300,000 car and claim it is for the sake of property values, then nobody's investments are safe. That is not just wrong, it is dangerous." The story aired that evening, and by the next morning, it had spread across social media. Karen's name was trending locally, and the Homeowners Association board was flooded with angry calls. Sponsors who had quietly supported Karen were suddenly silent, and the once untouchable queen of the cul-de-sac found herself under siege. Karen thought she could weather the storm, but what she did not realize was how quickly reputations collapse once money is involved. The Lamborghini was not just a car, it was a financial statement, a quantifiable investment, and proof that David had built his life on discipline and smart planning. Amanda, his attorney, moved fast. She filed both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit, listing property destruction, harassment, abuse of power, and emotional distress. More importantly, she filed for damages based on diminished asset value, which turned the lawsuit from tens of thousands into potentially hundreds of thousands. In financial terms, it was not simply a repair bill. It was a claim for lost equity. The courts understood these calculations well. David attended every meeting with Amanda, bringing neatly organized folders of evidence. His military training showed in every detail: timestamps, witness lists, even spreadsheets that outlined how the Lamborghini's value had been projected to appreciate before Karen's reckless act. Amanda shook her head in admiration. "Most clients scramble to put this together. You've built the case for me." Karen is going to regret ever touching your property. And David knew she was right. In the weeks that followed, Karen's Homeowners Association empire began to crack. Board members who had once backed her started questioning her judgment. The neighborhood was no longer united in whispers against David. It was fractured, with many siding openly with him. The media pressure did not help. Every news article repeated the same phrase: veteran's $300,000 Lamborghini destroyed by Homeowners Association president. That kind of headline carried weight. It painted Karen as reckless, unprofessional, and financially irresponsible. Even local real estate agents began speaking up, pointing out that Karen's actions did not protect property values, but instead threatened them. One agent said on camera, when potential buyers see headlines like this, they don't think stability, they think chaos. Karen has cost this neighborhood far more than one exotic car ever could. For David, this was vindication. The very argument Karen had used against him, that his Lamborghini hurt property values, was now being turned against her. The irony was rich, and David could not help but notice the shift in tone every time he walked outside. Neighbors who once avoided him now greeted him warmly, even stopping to thank him for standing up against Karen's abuse of power. Meanwhile, the Lamborghini itself became a symbol. The sight of it sitting under its protective tarp drew attention from reporters, photographers, even curious strangers driving by. To David, it was both painful and motivating. Every time he looked at the scratches, the broken windshield and the dented hood, he reminded himself that this was no longer just about a car. It was about principles, rights, and protecting what he had worked for. Amanda arranged for an appraiser to inspect the vehicle, and the report was damning. Repairs alone would exceed $50,000, but more importantly, the car's long-term value had dropped by nearly $100,000 because of its documented history of vandalism. That's your strongest leverage, Amanda explained. The law recognizes diminished value claims, and with video evidence, there's no escaping it. Karen's not just liable for the damage. She's liable for the financial future of that car. That's 6 figures, David, and judges don't look kindly on people who destroy assets as valuable as this. David nodded. It felt like a battlefield again, only this time the weapons were paper, numbers, and the truth. As the legal gears turned, Karen tried one last desperate maneuver. She called an emergency Homeowners Association meeting, demanding that the board vote to censure David and force him to remove the Lamborghini permanently. Her speech was fiery, laced with exaggerated claims that the car was a safety hazard, a distraction, even a magnet for crime. But when David calmly stood up to speak, everything changed. He laid out facts, that there were no bylaws prohibiting exotic cars, that Karen had personally vandalized his vehicle, that criminal charges were pending, and that she was abusing her position to wage a personal vendetta. Then he spoke about finances. He reminded the board that legal fees for defending Karen's actions would likely come out of community funds. Ask yourselves, David said, his voice steady. Do you want your dues used to cover the legal defense of someone who committed a felony? Or do you want those funds protecting your homes, your property values, and your community? The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, board members lowered their eyes. Karen's vote of confidence collapsed. By the end of the night, a motion was passed suspending her from her role as president pending the outcome of her trial. David's story spread even further after that meeting. Financial blogs picked it up, highlighting the case as an example of why asset protection is crucial for investors. Articles with titles like, Veterans Lamborghini shows why you must insure exotic assets in Homeowners Association gone wrong. How one man protected his investments went viral. The narrative shifted beyond local drama into a national conversation about property rights, homeowner abuse, and financial literacy. For David, it was almost surreal. He never wanted to be a public figure. He wanted peace, stability, and the quiet satisfaction of enjoying what he had earned. But life had thrown him into the spotlight, and he decided to use it. He gave interviews about smart investing, about diversifying portfolios, and about why understanding both your legal rights and your financial strategies mattered in today's world. Each time he spoke, he connected his Lamborghini not to vanity, but to discipline. That car isn't about showing off, he explained to one interviewer. It's about building something from nothing, making sacrifices, investing wisely, and then finally being able to enjoy the rewards. That's what Karen tried to destroy. Not just a car, but the principle of ownership itself. The audience response was overwhelming. As Karen's trial date drew closer, her desperation grew. She began flooding David with settlement offers, each one more frantic than the last. First, she offered to pay for repairs. Then, she offered an additional $20,000 for his trouble. Finally, through her lawyer, she proposed $50,000 and a public apology if David would drop the lawsuit. David reviewed each offer carefully, but Amanda advised him to stand firm. She's scared, Amanda explained. She knows she's going to lose, and if she loses in court, not only will she owe you full damages, but she'll also be barred from holding any position in the Homeowners Association again. She's trying to buy her way out of a verdict that will ruin her reputation permanently. But this is bigger than a settlement. This is about settlement. If you let her off easy, she'll keep doing this to others. If you let her off easy, she'll keep doing this to others. Go to trial. Send a message that no homeowner. He had always believed in finishing the mission, not cutting deals halfway through. So he made his decision. They would go to trial, and Karen would face every consequence she had earned. Behind the scenes, David also made moves of his own. He reached out to a friend from his military days who now worked in real estate consulting. Together, they drafted a plan to use his story as a case study for homeowners across the country. They wrote about legal rights, financial protections, and how to navigate disputes with homeowners associations without losing assets. Within weeks, the article was published in a national magazine. David was astonished by the response. Emails poured in from veterans, homeowners, and investors thanking him for shining a light on a problem many had faced in silence. Some even shared their own stories of losing thousands in unfair fines or being threatened with foreclosure by overreaching boards. David realized that his fight had become larger than himself. It had become a movement, one tied directly to protecting not just cars or homes, but financial independence and freedom of choice. For the first time, since the rock had shattered his windshield, David felt hope, not just for his own case, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by a power-hungry homeowners association leader. The courthouse was buzzing the morning David's case officially began. Local media filled the steps, cameras rolling as reporters jostled for position. Headlines blared across town. Homeowners Association President faces trial for vandalizing veteran's Lamborghini. For David, walking through those doors felt like stepping into another battlefield, this time with law books instead of rifles. Amanda, his attorney, walked beside him, radiating confidence. She had spent weeks preparing opening arguments, witness lists, and financial evidence. David carried himself with the same calm focus that had guided him through combat. This was not about ego. It was about justice, and about defending assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that Karen had recklessly destroyed. The moment Karen arrived, the contrast was striking. She looked frazzled, her once perfect composure shattered. Even her lawyer seemed reluctant, weighed down by the hopelessness of defending someone caught on video committing felony vandalism. Reporters swarmed her with questions about property values, but she pushed past them, refusing to speak. For the first time, Karen was no longer the queen of her cul-de-sac. She was a defendant, facing charges that could ruin her finances and her reputation forever. Amanda's opening statement set the tone. She painted a picture of David as a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country, invested wisely, and responsibly purchased a vehicle that doubled as both a passion and a financial asset. Then she pivoted to Karen, describing her as an abusive homeowners association president who overstepped her authority, harassed David for weeks, and ultimately vandalized a $300,000 Lamborghini. Amanda emphasized the financial implications: the repair bill, the diminished asset value, and the long-term damage to David's portfolio. This case is not just about broken glass and scratched paint, she told the jury. This is about a reckless act that destroyed the integrity of an investment, and when someone deliberately destroys assets of this value, they must be held accountable. The jurors leaned in, captivated. David watched their faces, noting the nods, the furrowed brows, the flashes of indignation. Amanda's words were landing exactly as planned. Karen's lawyer, by contrast, stammered through an opening that blamed David's Lamborghini for creating division in the community. Without evidence, it sounded hollow, like a child blaming the toy for breaking itself. Over the following days, testimony poured in. Neighbors took the stand, some reluctantly, others with fiery conviction. A retired teacher described watching Karen storm across David's driveway with the rock. Another neighbor admitted he had been skeptical of David's Lamborghini at first, but changed his mind after seeing Karen's escalating harassment. The most damning testimony came from a young couple who had recorded the entire incident from their balcony. Their video, projected on a large screen, silenced the courtroom. Every scratch, every scream, every frame of Karen smashing the windshield was undeniable. Karen sank lower in her seat with each replay, her lawyer's objections growing weaker by the minute. Amanda seized on the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, pointing to the video, "this is not a misunderstanding. This is not a dispute about property values. This is a deliberate, intentional act of destruction against a man's hard-earned property. A car that is not just a mode of transportation, but a financial investment, a part of his retirement strategy, and a representation of everything he sacrificed to build a stable future. The financial evidence came next, and it was devastating for Karen. Amanda brought in an appraiser who explained in clear, professional terms how exotic cars like the Lamborghini Aventador were considered appreciating assets in the collector's market. He presented charts showing historical price trends, explaining how David's specific model had already risen in value since purchase and was projected to climb higher if kept in pristine condition. Then he dropped the hammer. Because of Karen's vandalism, the car had lost nearly $100,000 in resale value, even after repairs. The jurors' eyes widened at the number. Karen's lawyer tried to dismiss it as speculative, but the appraiser countered with cold, hard market data. "In finance, perception is reality," he said. "Collectors pay premiums for vehicles with clean histories. Once a vehicle has documented damage, no matter how expertly repaired, its long-term value suffers. This is not speculation. It is economic fact." Amanda let the words hang in the air before adding, "And that $100,000 loss is directly traceable to the defendant's reckless actions." David watched as the jury scribbled notes furiously. Karen looked like she might collapse. As if that were not enough, Amanda introduced financial experts who explained the ripple effects of Karen's actions. A professor of economics testified that such acts undermine not only individual wealth, but community stability. When property owners cannot trust their assets to remain secure from abuse of power, investment in communities declines. This creates long-term damage to real estate markets and reduces overall financial confidence. David marveled at Amanda's strategy. She was not just proving vandalism, she was reframing Karen's act as a financial crime against the entire neighborhood. It was a masterstroke, one that connected directly to the jurors' own fears about home values and financial security. If it could happen to David, it could happen to anyone. And that realization hit home. Karen's lawyer weakly attempted to counter by suggesting David flaunted his wealth, but the jurors were unmoved. They were homeowners themselves, many of them with retirement plans tied up in fragile assets. They saw Karen's act not as envy, but as a threat to the principle of ownership itself. By the time Amanda rested her case, Karen's defense was in shambles. Her lawyer resorted to desperate measures, calling character witnesses to vouch for her commitment to the community. But cross-examinations shredded their credibility. One board member admitted under oath that Karen had pushed for fines without legal basis. Another confessed that he had resigned from the Homeowners Association out of frustration with her bullying tactics. Each confession was like another nail in the coffin. David sat silently through it all, outwardly calm, but inside he felt a mix of vindication and sorrow. He had not wanted this war, but once it began, he was determined to finish it. He thought of the Lamborghini under its tarp, the long nights of worry, the endless letters and fines, and he knew there was no turning back. Karen had taken this too far, and now the law was about to answer. The jury looked weary but resolute. Everyone in the room could feel the momentum swinging in David's favor. Amanda leaned over and whispered, "We are close, David. Stay strong. Tomorrow we give closing arguments, and then it will all be in their hands." That night, David returned home to silence. He walked past the Lamborghini, running his hand across the tarp, feeling the shape of the hood beneath it. The scratches and cracks were hidden now, but the memory of Karen's rage was still vivid. He thought about everything he had endured, battlefields, deployments, nights without sleep, and realized this fight carried its own kind of weight. It was not about bullets or bombs, but about principles, dignity, and financial security. He poured himself a glass of water, sat at his desk, and reviewed the spreadsheets Amanda had compiled. Numbers told a story just as clearly as words. Repair costs, diminished value, lost appreciation potential. It was all there, cold and undeniable. For the first time, David allowed himself to imagine what victory would feel like. Not just a legal win, but a personal one. A statement that he would not be bullied, that his sacrifices meant something, and that his financial legacy was worth defending. He closed his laptop, stood tall, and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, Justice." Then he turned out the light, ready for the final battle in court. The final morning of the trial arrived with an electric energy in the courthouse. The air was heavy, as though everyone present knew they were about to witness the climax of a story that had gripped the community. The hallways were crowded with reporters, their cameras flashing every time David or Amanda appeared. Even some residents from the neighborhood, who had quietly avoided involvement during the feud, now showed up in the gallery to see what would happen to Karen. David entered calmly, wearing his neatly pressed suit, posture upright, his military discipline unmistakable. He felt the same controlled anticipation he once had before stepping into missions. Steady breathing, sharp focus, no wasted movements. Amanda carried her thick binder of notes, but David knew she barely needed them now. Her command of the case had been flawless. Across the aisle, Karen sat hunched and pale, her hands trembling as she fiddled with a pen. The arrogance she once radiated had evaporated. The room had shifted. She was no longer the ruler of her cul-de-sac, but a defendant clinging to denial. When the judge entered and the trial resumed, Amanda rose for her closing arguments. She moved with deliberate calm, locking eyes with the jury one by one. "This case," she began, her voice strong and measured, "is about accountability. It is about the destruction of a man's property, yes. But more importantly, it is about what that property represented. Responsibility, sacrifice, investment, security." She gestured toward David, who sat silently, his face calm but resolute. David is a veteran who served this nation. He invested wisely, he planned for his future, and he purchased a vehicle that was not only a passion, but an appreciating asset worth $300,000. Karen, the president of the Homeowners Association, abused her power. She vandalized his Lamborghini not because he violated rules, but because she was envious and angry. She did not just scratch paint, she smashed the... And when someone in a position of trust abuses power this way, the consequences must be clear and undeniable. The jury leaned forward, hanging on every word. Karen's lawyer tried desperately to spin his closing remarks into sympathy. He spoke of stress, of misunderstandings, of a woman overwhelmed by the responsibilities of leadership. He insisted that David's Lamborghini had divided the neighborhood and provoked resentment, framing Karen's actions as a regrettable but understandable mistake. But his words rang hollow against the tidal wave of evidence. The video, the testimony, the appraisals, all still fresh in the jury's mind. His voice grew shaky as he attempted to dismiss the financial losses as exaggerated, but the charts and expert analyses could not be erased. He ended by begging the jury not to ruin a woman's life over a moment of bad judgment. Yet when he sat down, even Karen seemed unconvinced. She stared at the table, her face ashen. The once proud leader of the Homeowners Association was reduced to a shadow, caught in the wreckage of her own choices. David watched, unblinking, remembering the sound of his windshield shattering under her rock. This was not stress. This was malice. And it was time for judgment. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. That fact alone told David everything. When the foreman stood and announced they had reached a verdict, the entire room held its breath. The judge called for silence and the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty on all counts of criminal mischief, vandalism, and property destruction. Guilty on civil liability for damages exceeding $100,000. Guilty for abusing her position as Homeowners Association president. Karen gasped as though the air had been sucked from her lungs. Her lawyer lowered his head in defeat. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail of the downfall. Amanda remained composed, though a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. David sat still, processing the words, the months of tension finally beginning to release from his shoulders. He glanced at the jury. Ordinary people, homeowners, workers, retirees, who had seen through the lies and chosen truth. For the first time, David felt justice not as an abstract concept, but as something real, delivered in the voices of 12 strangers who had understood his fight. The sentencing came days later, and it was severe. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution for the Lamborghini's repairs and diminished value, over $120,000. She was fined personally for abusing her authority within the Homeowners Association. The judge imposed community service and probation, along with mandatory counseling. But the financial hit was the most devastating. Karen had to mortgage her own home to cover the damages, her savings drained, her reputation in ruins. She was forced to resign from the Homeowners Association, her name permanently tainted in local circles. David watched from the gallery, stone-faced. He had not wanted vengeance. He had wanted accountability. And now it was here. The gavel came down, and the chapter officially closed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. One asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" David paused before answering. "This was never about pride," he said. "This was about protecting what I worked for, about standing up against abuse, and about making sure others know they don't have to accept being bullied, financially or otherwise. You fight, you stand your ground, and justice can win." Cameras flashed as his words echoed across the evening news. In the weeks that followed, David's life slowly returned to normal. The Lamborghini, restored and gleaming once again, sat proudly in his garage, though now with a story etched into its history. He drove it sparingly, knowing the resale value would never fully recover, but also recognizing that some things were priceless. The car had become a symbol, not just of his service or his taste, but of resilience. Friends and neighbors who had once kept their distance now came by to shake his hand, to apologize, to thank him for standing up to the Homeowners Association's abuses. Some admitted they had been intimidated by Karen for years, but never dared to speak up. David realized he had not just fought for himself, he had fought for all of them. And in doing so, he had changed the dynamic of the neighborhood forever. Karen was gone, her hold broken, and in her place stood a community that respected boundaries and valued fairness. The Lamborghini gleamed under the sun, its lines sharp, its engine still roaring like a lion. A scarred investment, yes, but one worth more than dollars now. David also took the ordeal as a lesson in financial planning. He met with his wealth advisor to reassess his portfolio, using the trial as a reminder that even the most solid investments carried risks, not just market risks, but social ones. Together, they expanded his holdings, diversifying further into index funds, dividend stocks, and real estate investment trusts. The Lamborghini, though diminished in value, remained a unique asset in his collection, alongside his modest rental properties. Amanda had been right all along. Cars like his were more than machines. They were financial instruments tied to perception and reputation. He wrote down notes for younger veterans he mentored, advising them not just about service benefits and pensions, but also about asset protection, insurance, and legal preparedness. "You never know when envy will put a target on your back," he told them. "So you plan ahead. You protect yourself legally and financially. That's just as important as any battlefield strategy." His mentees listened intently, taking his words to heart, realizing that financial literacy was as much a shield as body armor. The neighborhood's homeowners association restructured after Karen's downfall. New leadership was elected, and laws were rewritten to prevent abuse of power. Transparency became the new standard, with financial records published openly and community votes required for major decisions. David was invited to run for the board, but he politely declined. "I've fought my fight," he said. "Now it's up to others to lead with fairness." Still, his influence remained. Residents who once whispered about his Lamborghini now saw it as a reminder of what happens when injustice is challenged. The car story became local legend, told at block parties and homeowner meetings, a cautionary tale of how envy and arrogance could destroy not only property, but entire reputations. Karen herself was rarely seen, having moved away in shame. Her home, once the site of neighborhood gatherings, sat on the market for months, its value dropping with each failed sale. Prospective buyers balked at the stigma attached to her name. For David, this was not schadenfreude, but proof of a larger truth. Markets, whether of cars or homes, respond to trust and perception. Once lost, they are hard to regain. As time passed, David reflected on the journey. He thought about the Lamborghini, about Karen, about the courthouse, about Amanda's sharp mind and unrelenting pursuit of justice. He realized that the real victory was not financial, though the restitution had restored much of his losses. The real victory was personal, a reaffirmation that he could still fight, still endure, still hold the line when tested. It was about dignity. It was about showing his wife, his neighbors, and himself that he would never back down from bullies. The Lamborghini roared again on weekend drives, turning heads, reminding him of the road he had traveled. It was no longer just a car. It was a scarred shield, a battle standard, a rolling testament to resilience. And though its resale value might have fallen, in David's heart it was worth far more than $300,000. It was priceless. His investment in it had paid off in ways no stock chart could measure. He had defended his property, his name, and his principles. And in the end, that was the greatest return of all.